the most dangerous thing that ever happened to Dorian Gray was not the portrait. It was the fact that the portrait kept telling him the truth. Most people read the Picture of Dorian Gray as a warning about vanity. A beautiful young man becomes obsessed with preserving his appearance, and everything falls apart from there. But what if that isn't the real warning at all? What if beauty is only the bait, and the deeper danger is something far more familiar to us today? Because Dorian's true obsession wasn't youth. It was consequence. And those are not the same thing. Think about it. Every human being is shaped by consequences. Regret teaches caution. Failure teaches humility. Loss teaches perspective. Whether we like it or not, consequences are the invisible force that carves out identity. They leave marks on us. They become part of who we are. But what happens when someone finds a way to escape those marks? What happens when every mistake disappears from public view? That question sits at the heart of Dorian Gray, and it's far more unsettling than a story about appearance. At first glance, Dorian seems like the center of the novel. But in many ways, he functions more like an experiment. A test case. A living question placed under a microscope. What remains of a person when actions no longer leave visible scars? That question becomes even stranger when we look at the most important object in the story. Not Dorian. The portrait. A painting locked away in a dark room. A face frozen in perfection. A silent witness that remembers everything. That image is our first memory fragment. A flawless face untouched by time, hidden somewhere above the world, while something unseen slowly changes in the shadows. And here's where the contradiction begins. Most people assume the portrait is the curse. But what if it was the safeguard? What if the painting was the last remaining part of reality refusing to lie? The portrait does something no admirer, no friend, no social circle can do. It records consequences. It preserves truth. It becomes a ledger of choices in a world increasingly detached from accountability. And suddenly, Dorian stops looking like a fictional character. He starts looking like a pattern. A pattern that appears whenever image becomes more valuable than identity. Whenever reputation becomes more important than character. Whenever appearance is allowed to replace reality. That's why this story has survived for generations. Not because people are fascinated by beauty, but because they recognize the temptation hidden underneath it. The temptation to separate who we are from what we do. The temptation to enjoy rewards without paying costs. The temptation to lock our own portrait in a dark room and pretend it isn't there. But that raises a much bigger question. If consequences are the very thing that shape human character, then what happens to a person who spends years avoiding them? And more importantly, what happens to an entire culture that starts rewarding the same behavior? But there is a deeper paradox hiding beneath all of this. If the portrait was recording the truth, why didn't the truth save him? We tend to assume that awareness leads to change. That once a person sees what they are becoming, they will naturally turn back. Yet history, psychology, and everyday life suggest something far more unsettling. People do not always change when they encounter the truth. Sometimes they adapt to it. Sometimes they learn to live beside it. And sometimes they build entire identities around avoiding it. That is where Dorian becomes more than a literary character. He becomes a model of a very specific human contradiction. Not ignorance. Awareness without transformation. Think about the role of the portrait for a moment. It does not hunt him. It does not force him. It does not control him. It simply waits. Silent. Patient. A witness hidden behind a locked door. This is our next memory fragment, a forgotten room containing the only honest record of a person's life. And that image raises a troubling question. Why does the room have to stay locked? Because every human being depends on a story about themselves. A story that explains who they are. A story that protects their sense of identity. The problem begins when that story and reality start moving in opposite directions. At first, the gap is small. Almost invisible. Then it grows. And the larger it becomes, the more expensive the truth becomes. This is the contradiction at the center of Dorian's conflict. The portrait becomes more valuable with every revelation. Yet looking at it becomes more painful with every revelation. The thing he needs most becomes the thing he wants least. And that pattern extends far beyond one fictional character. Organizations do it. Governments do it. Entire cultures do it. The more a system depends on an illusion, the more dangerous reality becomes. That is the first major scale shift hidden inside the novel. What appears to be a personal struggle is actually a universal pattern. The conflict is not between beauty and ugliness. It is between comfort and truth. Between self-preservation and self-confrontation. Between the image we present and the evidence we hide. And this is where another important figure enters the story, not as a person, but as a force. Influence. Dorian does not exist in isolation. Ideas shape him. Voices shape him. Worldviews shape him. One of the most powerful insights in the novel is that corruption rarely arrives wearing the face of evil. It often arrives disguised as freedom. As sophistication. As self-expression. As permission. Permission to stop questioning yourself. Permission to stop measuring consequences. Permission to believe that desire alone should determine what is right. That revelation changes everything. Because now the portrait no longer looks like a supernatural object. It begins to resemble something else entirely. A moral instrument. A device that measures a cost nobody else can see. And yet the mystery only deepens. If the portrait represents truth, then why does truth remain hidden? Why isn't it displayed for the entire world to see? Why is it confined to darkness? Perhaps because the novel is pointing toward an uncomfortable reality. The greatest deceptions are rarely performed for other people. They are performed for ourselves. Which leads to an even larger question. If Dorian's real danger was not temptation, but the growing distance between who he believed he was and who he was becoming, then how much distance can a person create before that gap becomes impossible to cross? But perhaps the most dangerous stage of corruption is not when a person chooses the wrong path. It is when they stop believing there is a path back. Because once that happens, something fundamental changes. The conflict is no longer between truth and deception. It becomes a conflict between two competing identities. The person you are, and the person you must pretend to be in order to avoid confronting the truth. This is where the crisis truly begins. Most people imagine corruption as a dramatic transformation. A sudden fall. A visible collapse. The novel suggests something much more subtle. Corruption often feels like stability. The illusion remains intact. The image remains protected. The world continues to respond to the version of you that it expects to see. And that creates a terrifying contradiction. If the illusion continues to work, why abandon it? If the rewards keep coming, why question the system that delivers them? This is the trap hidden inside Dorian's role. The portrait preserves evidence, but the world rewards appearance. One system measures reality. The other rewards performance. And as those two systems move farther apart, the pressure begins to build. Not external pressure. Internal pressure. The pressure of maintaining a false equilibrium. Imagine a perfectly polished mirror hanging on a wall. Now imagine a crack forming beneath the surface where nobody can see it. Then another. And another. The mirror still looks flawless from across the room. But its structure is quietly weakening. That is our next memory fragment. Not a monster. Not a curse. A beautiful mirror hiding invisible fractures. The deeper insight is that Dorian's greatest enemy is no longer morality. It is fragmentation. His identity begins to split into separate worlds. One world contains admiration. The other contains truth. One world is public. The other is hidden. One world moves forward. The other remains locked inside a dark room, accumulating evidence. And here the story expands beyond the individual once again. Because civilizations experience the same phenomenon. Institutions experience the same phenomenon. Entire cultures can become trapped between image and reality. History is filled with examples of systems that looked strongest immediately before they began to fail. Why? Because appearances often improve long after foundations have started to erode. That is why warning signs are so often ignored. They do not arrive when collapse becomes obvious. They arrive when success still appears normal. This creates another contradiction. The portrait becomes more alarming with every revelation. Yet its existence also proves that recovery remains possible. As long as the evidence exists, there is still a chance to face it. There is still a chance to change. There is still a chance to close the gap between identity and reality. So why does that chance continue to shrink? Because every avoided truth creates a new investment in the illusion. Every compromise must be justified. Every justification must be defended. Every defense requires another layer of self-deception. And eventually the original problem is no longer the problem. The illusion itself becomes the thing that must be protected at all costs. This is the escalation hidden beneath the surface of the novel. The conflict evolves from protecting beauty to protecting a narrative. From preserving an image to preserving an entire worldview. And that raises a mystery far larger than one man standing before a portrait. What if the portrait is not measuring moral failure at all? What if it is measuring something even deeper? What if every change appearing on that hidden canvas is evidence of a growing separation between reality and identity? And if that is true, then an even more unsettling question emerges. At what point does a person stop hiding from the truth and start becoming the lie itself? Before we continue, the strongest revelation hidden inside the story is not about corruption. It is about measurement. What exactly was the portrait measuring? Up to this point, it is easy to assume that it functions like a moral scoreboard, recording good choices and bad choices. But that explanation is too simple. It does not fully explain why the image becomes such a powerful symbol. The deeper revelation is that the portrait appears to measure distance. Not the distance between innocence and guilt. Not even the distance between beauty and decay. It measures the distance between reality and self-perception. This changes the entire framework. Because a person can survive mistakes. A person can survive failure. A person can even survive moral confusion. What becomes far more difficult to survive is a complete separation from reality itself. The portrait becomes significant because it preserves an objective record in a world increasingly dominated by subjective narratives. It remains anchored while everything else drifts. That is why it becomes such a threatening presence. Not because it contains darkness, but because it refuses revision. It cannot be negotiated with. It cannot be persuaded. It cannot be edited. It simply remains. This gives us another memory fragment, a sealed archive collecting every truth that someone wishes could be forgotten. And suddenly the portrait begins to resemble something larger than a literary symbol. It resembles memory itself. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to reinterpret their past. We soften our failures. We justify our compromises. We reshape events until they fit the identity we want to preserve. Memory becomes flexible. Narrative becomes flexible. But what if there existed a record that could not be altered? What if every compromise remained visible forever? That possibility points toward a profound philosophical insight. The greatest threat to the human ego is not punishment. It is accuracy. We often imagine that people fear consequences because consequences bring pain. Yet many fear consequences because consequences bring clarity. They reveal patterns. They expose motivations. They remove comforting ambiguity. The portrait functions as an instrument of clarity. And clarity becomes increasingly dangerous when identity depends upon illusion. This is where the role of influence becomes more important than the role of temptation. The most transformative ideas in the story are not destructive because they encourage pleasure. They are destructive because they redefine accountability. Once a person begins to believe that experience matters more than responsibility, or that desire matters more than truth, an entirely new operating system emerges. The rules do not disappear. They simply become invisible. The consequences do not vanish. They merely accumulate somewhere else. This creates a scale shift from the individual to the civilizational. Every society develops mechanisms for storing consequences. Some are legal. Some are cultural. Some are psychological. Some are historical. The portrait symbolizes the reality that consequences never truly disappear. They migrate. They wait. They accumulate beyond immediate visibility. Which leads us toward a far more unsettling possibility. Perhaps the portrait was never acting as a judge. Perhaps it was acting as a messenger. A warning system. A final bridge connecting identity to reality before that connection could be permanently lost. And if that is true, then a much larger revelation begins to emerge from the shadows. The real danger may not be corruption itself. The real danger may be the moment a person stops recognizing warnings as warnings and starts viewing them as obstacles. Because once that happens, what remains capable of bringing them back? So what was the portrait ultimately trying to reveal? Not that actions have consequences. Not that beauty fades. Not even that corruption exists. The deepest revelation is far more unsettling. The portrait reveals that the human soul is not destroyed by wrongdoing alone. It is destroyed when reality and identity become permanently disconnected. That is the hidden center of the entire story. The painting does not merely track behavior. It tracks separation. Separation between what is true and what is acknowledged. Separation between what is known and what is admitted. Separation between the self that exists and the self that is performed. And once we see this, everything suddenly aligns. The portrait. The hidden room. The growing distance between appearance and reality. The influence of seductive ideas. The refusal to confront warning after warning. These are not separate elements. They are components of a single system. A system built around one dangerous illusion, the belief that a person can escape becoming the consequences of their choices. That is the mistake most readers miss. The central question is not whether consequences arrive. They always arrive. The real question is where they arrive. In this story, they do not appear on the surface. They migrate. They accumulate in the unseen. That is why the portrait matters so much. It serves as a visual representation of a universal principle. Nothing disappears. Every compromise becomes structure. Every justification becomes architecture. Every repeated decision becomes identity. This gives us perhaps the most important memory fragment in the entire project, a magnificent house standing under bright sunlight while hidden cracks spread through its foundation. The walls still stand. The windows still shine. Visitors still admire it. But the collapse has already begun beneath the surface. That image is not about one character. It is about human nature. Because most people do not lose themselves all at once. They lose themselves gradually. One rationalization at a time. One avoidance at a time. One unreconciled truth at a time. And this is where the portrait becomes something even larger than a moral symbol. It becomes a model of psychological reality. Every human being possesses some version of that hidden canvas. A private record. A place where accumulated contradictions are stored. A place where reality waits patiently while narratives change around it. The philosophical implication is profound. Identity is not created by what we claim to believe. Identity is created by what we repeatedly become. That distinction changes everything. It means that self-deception is not merely an error. It is a force. A force capable of reshaping perception. Reshaping judgment. Reshaping entire lives. And when enough people participate in the same self-deception, it begins reshaping cultures as well. This is the next scale shift. What begins as an internal conflict eventually becomes a collective one. A society can become trapped by the same pattern. Rewarding image over substance. Performance over reality. Narrative over truth. The same separation that destroys an individual can gradually weaken institutions, communities, and civilizations. Which is why the story continues to feel modern more than a century later. Its warning was never limited to one person. It was aimed at anyone tempted to believe that reality can be permanently postponed. Because reality has a strange property. It is patient. It does not need attention to exist. It does not need belief to remain true. It simply waits. And that leaves us with a consequence far larger than the character at the center of the story. If every avoided truth eventually becomes part of our identity, and if every hidden contradiction continues accumulating beneath the surface, then what happens not to a person, but to an entire culture when the gap between appearance and reality becomes too large to sustain? What remains after a person spends years separating appearance from reality? Not freedom. Not fulfillment. Not even control. What remains is burden. Because every system built on avoidance eventually inherits a cost. And the cost is rarely paid where people expect. One of the most important consequences hidden inside this story is that reality does not disappear when it is ignored. It simply stops participating in the conversation. It withdraws. It waits. It allows the illusion to continue until the illusion becomes dependent upon its own maintenance. This is where the legacy of the central conflict becomes visible. The danger was never that a person could create a false image. Human beings have always done that. The danger is that maintaining the image gradually becomes the primary purpose of life itself. When that happens, identity transforms into a defensive structure. Energy that could have been used for growth becomes dedicated to preservation. Curiosity becomes replaced by justification. Self-examination becomes replaced by self-protection. And truth becomes something to manage rather than something to seek. That is the psychological consequence. But the legacy extends much further. Consider another memory fragment. A locked room no one visits anymore. Dust gathering on the floor. A hidden object silently accumulating years of neglected truth. The room remains isolated. Yet everything outside the room is shaped by what exists inside it. That image captures something profound about human systems. Whether we are discussing individuals, institutions, or entire societies, unresolved contradictions do not remain isolated. They radiate outward. They influence decisions. They alter priorities. They quietly reshape the future. This is why the story feels less like a cautionary tale and more like a diagnostic tool. It allows us to recognize a pattern. Whenever a culture rewards appearance more than substance, the same dynamic emerges. Whenever reputation becomes more valuable than character, the same dynamic emerges. Whenever performance becomes more important than reality, the same dynamic emerges. The names change. The technology changes. The historical period changes. The pattern remains. And that pattern may be the true legacy of the work. Not a lesson about morality. A lesson about structure. Because structures built on reality tend to correct themselves. Structures built on illusion require constant maintenance. The first grows stronger through truth. The second grows weaker through concealment. This creates a remarkable paradox. The person who spends years avoiding discomfort often inherits greater instability. The person willing to confront difficult truths often inherits greater freedom. The short-term cost and the long-term cost reverse places. And perhaps that is why the hidden portrait remains such a powerful symbol generations later. Not because it represents punishment. Not because it represents judgment. But because it represents continuity. A record that cannot be negotiated away. A reminder that every choice becomes part of a larger pattern. A reminder that identity is not what we display. Identity is what remains when display is removed. This is the final and most enduring memory fragment before we reach the end of the journey. A flawless public image standing in bright light. A forgotten room containing the accumulated weight of reality. And an invisible bridge connecting them whether anyone chooses to acknowledge it or not. That bridge is the true inheritance of the story. It extends far beyond a single character. Far beyond a single era. Far beyond literature itself. Because every generation develops new ways to project images into the world. Yet every generation faces the same ancient question. What happens when the image becomes so convincing that even its creator begins to believe it? And if that is the risk facing individuals, institutions, and entire civilizations alike, then perhaps the final mystery is not hidden inside the portrait at all. Perhaps the final mystery is why human beings continue repeating this pattern even after recognizing it. Perhaps that is why this story refuses to stay in the past. Not because it predicts the future. Not because it offers simple moral lessons. But because it reveals something permanent about the human condition. At the center of everything stands a strange image. A beautiful face untouched by time. A locked room hidden from view. A silent record that never stops telling the truth. Those fragments linger in memory because they point toward something larger than a single life. They point toward a tension that exists inside every person. The tension between who we are becoming and who we believe ourselves to be. And maybe that is the final insight. The story was never really about corruption. Corruption was only the symptom. The deeper subject was separation. The slow widening distance between reality and self-understanding. The widening distance between consequence and awareness. The widening distance between what is visible and what is true. That distance can emerge anywhere. In ambition. In success. In ideology. In institutions. In relationships. In entire civilizations. The details change, but the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Human beings possess extraordinary creative power. We create stories, identities, reputations, and systems of meaning. These abilities allow us to build cultures, communities, and futures. Yet those same abilities carry a hidden risk. We can become so skilled at constructing narratives that we begin mistaking them for reality itself. And that is where the enduring significance of this work resides. Not in the portrait. Not in the symbolism. Not even in the character at its center. Its lasting power comes from forcing us to confront a question that never becomes obsolete. How much truth is necessary for a human being to remain fully human? That question feels just as relevant now as it did generations ago. We live in an age capable of displaying almost anything. Images travel instantly. Reputations can be built at incredible speed. Entire identities can be curated, refined, filtered, and projected into the world. Yet beneath all technological change, the ancient problem remains exactly the same. Reality still exists. Consequences still accumulate. Choices still shape identity. Whether they are acknowledged or not. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all. The greatest dangers are not always the ones that announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly. As convenience. As comfort. As the gradual habit of looking away. The final memory fragment is not a person standing before a portrait. It is a door. A door leading to a room most people would rather keep closed. Inside that room is not judgment. Inside that room is not punishment. Inside that room is simply truth. Waiting. Patiently. The story endures because every generation must decide what to do with that door. Whether to open it. Whether to ignore it. Or whether to spend an entire lifetime pretending it is not there. And perhaps the most important question is not what happened to one individual long ago. Perhaps the real question is this: if every human being carries a hidden room somewhere within them, and if every life leaves behind a portrait that records what no audience can see, then what ultimately shapes our future more deeply, the image we present to the world, or the truths we are willing to face when nobody else is watching? And maybe the answer to that question has always been waiting behind the door.